Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Tennessee. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1877, the small settlement of Hollow Creek, nestled in the foothills of the Cumberland Mountains in eastern Tennessee, became the reluctant host to a series of events that would haunt the collective memory of the region for generations. What began as whispers among local residents about a strange visitor would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing chapters in Tennessee's post-Civil War history. A chapter filled with silence, paranoia, and a fundamental question that still echoes today. How does a man shot 7 times at close range simply disappear without a trace? The year 1877 marked a period of uneasy reconstruction in Tennessee. The scars of the Civil War remained fresh in the minds of those who had survived it. Hollow Creek, with its population of barely 300 souls, was largely untouched by the industrial progress that had begun to transform larger cities. Time moved differently here, slower, more deliberate, as if the mountains themselves dictated the rhythm of life. The nearest proper town, Maryville, lay some 15 miles to the southwest, connected by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable during the rainy season. The settlement itself consisted of roughly 40 structures arranged along a central dirt thoroughfare that locals simply called the road. At the northern end stood the Methodist Church, a modest white clapboard building with a bell tower that had been repaired 3 times since Confederate artillery practice had damaged it in 1863. Moving south, one would pass Martha Winter's boarding house, a 2-story structure with a sagging front porch where, on warm evenings, residents would gather to exchange news and gossip. Across from it stood William Harmon's General Store, the commercial heart of Hollow Creek, where everything from salt pork to boot leather could be obtained, and where the town's only telegraph machine connected the isolated community to the wider world. Further along stood the blacksmith's shop operated by Isaac Turner, a former Union soldier who had married a local woman and settled in Hollow Creek, despite initial suspicion from the predominantly Confederate sympathizing population. The shop's forge could be heard from dawn until dusk, a rhythmic soundtrack to daily life that the residents had come to find comforting in its constancy. Beyond that lay Dr. Samuel Blackwood's combined home and medical practice, identifiable by the small sign bearing a caduceus that hung beside the front door. At the southern limit of the settlement, Sheriff Thomas Grayson maintained his office and the town's 2 jail cells in a sturdy brick building that had once served as a supply depot during the war. Beyond these central establishments, modest homes with small gardens and livestock pens stretched into the surrounding forest. The eastern edge of town terminated abruptly at a steep slope that led down to Hollow Creek itself, the narrow waterway that had given the settlement its name. To the west, the land gradually rose toward the foothills of the Cumberland Mountains, whose distant peaks were visible on clear days, standing like silent sentinels over the isolated community. It was along the main road on September 23, 1877, that a stranger arrived in Hollow Creek. According to the town ledger, maintained by storekeeper William Harmon, the man gave his name as Elias Morgan. He paid for 2 weeks' lodging at the town's only boarding house with Confederate currency, a detail that raised eyebrows but was reluctantly accepted by Martha Winters, the widow who ran the establishment. Morgan stood over 6 feet tall, with a gaunt face partially obscured by a thick black beard. His eyes, as described in multiple accounts, were remarkably pale, almost colorless, giving him an unsettling, spectral appearance. The ledger entry, preserved now in the county archives, records Morgan's arrival in Harmon's precise handwriting. September 23, 1877. Stranger arrived midday. Name given as Elias Morgan. Purchased supplies including drafting paper, tobacco, and 3 boxes of ammunition for a Colt revolver. Paid with Confederate notes. Claimed to be serving for Tennessee Valley Railroad. A note added later, in a different ink but the same hand, reads simply, "No such survey commissioned." Morgan claimed to be a surveyor working for the Tennessee Valley Railroad, inspecting possible routes for a new line. Yet, as would later be noted in Sheriff Thomas Grayson's report dated October 30th, 1877, no such survey had been commissioned in the area. The railroad company, when contacted months later, had no record of employing anyone by the name of Elias Morgan. This discrepancy, however, would not come to light until after the events that followed. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the violence that would later unfold, but the methodical, almost ritualistic nature of Morgan's integration into the small community. He established routines, he created normalcy, and behind that carefully constructed facade, something else entirely was taking shape. The boarding house where Morgan took residence had 8 rooms on the second floor, with Morgan occupying the easternmost chamber, overlooking the dense forest that encroached upon the town's boundaries. Martha Winters would later testify that Morgan requested this specific room after inspecting all available options, claiming the morning light would aid his work. The room had previously belonged to Martha's husband, Gerald, who had perished 3 years earlier from tuberculosis. According to Martha's private journal recovered in 1954 during renovations of the property, she had preserved the room exactly as Gerald had left it, a shrine of sorts to her departed spouse. "I showed Mr. Morgan all available rooms," Martha wrote on September 23rd, "and though the western chamber is larger and has a better view of the road, he insisted upon Gerald's old room. I was reluctant to let a stranger disturb what I had kept so carefully preserved, but business has been poor, and I cannot afford to turn away paying guests. Still, when I opened the door, I felt as if I were betraying Gerald somehow." Mr. Morgan stood in the doorway for the longest time, just staring at the arrangement of furniture, the books on the shelf, the writing desk positioned exactly as Gerald preferred it. He asked no questions about the previous occupant, yet somehow I felt he already knew. The room itself was modestly furnished with a single bed, a pine wardrobe, a writing desk positioned beneath the window, and a small bookshelf containing Gerald Winters' collection of theological texts and military histories. A faded daguerreotype of Martha and Gerald on their wedding day hung on the wall opposite the bed. According to Martha's journal, Morgan asked for this to be removed on his first night, claiming that he found it difficult to sleep with eyes watching him. She complied, though noted her discomfort at handling the cherished image. Within days of his arrival, Morgan established a routine that the townspeople quickly grew accustomed to. He would leave the boarding house at precisely 7 in the morning, carrying a leather satchel and what appeared to be surveying equipment. He would return at dusk, often with soil samples and hand-drawn maps that he would spread across his desk. He took his evening meals alone in his room, requesting that Martha leave the tray outside his door. On Sundays, unlike most residents, he did not attend the local Methodist church, but instead walked to the edge of town where the old Civil War cemetery lay, spending hours among the weathered headstones. The cemetery itself deserves particular mention, as it would later figure prominently in the unfolding mystery. Established during the war as a necessity rather than as a planned resting place, it occupied a low hill approximately half a mile northwest of the town proper. Most of the graves were marked with simple wooden crosses that had, by 1877, begun to rot and lean at precarious angles. Only a few stone markers existed, reserved for officers or local citizens of prominence. In the northwestern corner, separated from the individual graves by a low stone wall, lay the mass grave where 16 unidentified Confederate soldiers had been interred following a skirmish in February 1863. This grave was marked by a single, weathered stone bearing only the inscription, "Confederate Dead, 1863," and the rough carving of a crossed sword and rifle. According to local tradition, the precise number of bodies in the grave was uncertain, as some of the casualties had been so badly mangled by artillery fire that complete identification and separation had proven impossible. The townspeople generally avoided this section of the cemetery, partly out of respect and partly due to a vague unease about the hasty, undignified nature of the burial. Dr. Samuel Blackwood, the town's physician, noted in his personal records that he observed Morgan on 3 separate occasions standing motionless at the perimeter of this mass grave, staring at the memorial stone with an intensity that Blackwood found disturbing. Once, when Blackwood approached, intending to engage the stranger in conversation, Morgan acknowledged his presence with a curt nod before abruptly departing, leaving the physician with the distinct impression that he had interrupted some private ritual. Blackwood's journal entry from October 5, 1877 reads, "Encountered Morgan again at the Confederate grave. His behavior grows increasingly peculiar. Today he was kneeling beside the marker, his lips moving as if in prayer, though no sound emerged. When he became aware of my presence, he quickly gathered something from the ground. I believe it may have been soil samples, though for what purpose a railroad surveyor would collect cemetery soil, I cannot imagine. His eyes, always unsettling in their pallor, seemed to hold a strange light today, almost feverish in their intensity. I'm beginning to wonder if the man suffers from some nervous condition. Must remember to mention my concerns to Sheriff Grayson." By the 2nd week of October, Morgan had become a familiar, if not entirely welcome, fixture in Hollow Creek. He spoke little, smiled less, but performed small gestures that prevented the community from openly rejecting his presence. He assisted the blacksmith Isaac Turner when one of the forge's support beams cracked during a repair job. He helped Martha Winters replace a broken window shutter during an unexpected storm. These actions, recorded in various town accounts, suggest a calculated effort to establish a veneer of acceptance. Turner's own account, shared years later with a journalist from the Knoxville Sentinel, described the incident at his forge. "The main support beam had split clean through, and I was struggling to brace it before the whole roof came down." Morgan appeared in the doorway, said nothing, just assessed the situation, and immediately moved to help. He knew exactly what needed doing, working with the precision of a man who'd spent years around such structures. What struck me most was his strength. He lifted beams that would normally require 2 men. But there was something mechanical about his movements, as if he were performing a duty rather than offering genuine assistance. When we finished, I offered him payment, or at least a drink for his trouble. He declined both with a strange comment that has stayed with me all these years. He said, "Some debts can't be settled with money or liquor." Then he walked out before I could ask what he meant. Yet beneath this careful integration, suspicions began to take root. William Harmon's wife, Elizabeth, recorded in a letter to her sister in Knoxville that Morgan's surveying expeditions never seemed to follow a consistent pattern. Some days he would head north, others south, occasionally venturing into areas that bore no relevance to any conceivable railroad route. More concerning were the nighttime excursions that several residents, including the town's deputy sheriff, Malcolm Reed, observed but never officially reported until after the events that followed. Elizabeth Harmon's letter, dated October 12, 1877, contains this revealing passage. "Our mysterious guest, Mr. Morgan, continues to perplex the town with his odd behaviors. William has taken to tracking his purchases, which include items no surveyor would require, salt in quantities too large for one man's consumption, candles by the dozen, and most recently, a length of rope sufficient to hang a man." When William casually inquired about these purchases, Morgan replied that preparations must be thorough. What preparations? He would not say. Mrs. Turner claims she has seen lights moving among the trees near the old Stewart place well past midnight, though her husband dismisses this as imagination. I am not so certain. There is something in Morgan's gaze that chills me, sister. It is as if he is looking not at you, but through you, to something beyond. According to Reed's later testimony, preserved in the county archives in Maryville, he had witnessed Morgan leaving the boarding house on at least 4 occasions well past midnight, carrying his satchel but none of his surveying equipment. On one such night, Reed followed at a distance and observed Morgan entering the abandoned Stewart property, a decaying farmhouse, approximately 2 miles east of town, that had stood empty since its owners had relocated to Missouri in 1871. The Stewart property occupied a peculiar place in local consciousness. Originally built in the 1840s by Jacob Stewart, a prosperous tobacco farmer, the house had been commandeered during the war to serve as a field hospital, following the skirmish that had filled the mass grave in the cemetery. For 3 weeks, wounded and dying Confederate soldiers had been treated within its walls, their blood soaking into the pine floorboards. After the war, when the Stewart family returned, they found their once proud home forever altered by the suffering that had taken place there. Jacob's wife, Marion, reportedly refused to sleep in the house, claiming she could hear the moans of the dying in the night wind. The family constructed a small cabin nearby and used the main house only for storage until 1871, when they abandoned the property altogether. By 1877, the Stewart house had fallen into significant disrepair. The roof had partially collapsed on the western side, exposing the upper floor to the elements. Vandals had broken most of the windows, and local children dared each other to spend the night within its walls, though few managed to remain past midnight before fleeing from real or imagined sounds. The surrounding fields had been reclaimed by the forest, with only the stone fence posts marking what had once been the boundary of a productive farm. What Morgan did inside the Stewart house remains unknown. Reed, admitting a reluctance that would later haunt him, chose not to investigate further. The property had acquired a certain reputation among the more superstitious residents of Hollow Creek, not due to any supernatural occurrences, but because of its history as a makeshift field hospital during the war, where dozens of soldiers had succumbed to their wounds. The blood-stained floorboards had never been replaced, and tales circulated of how the walls seemed to seep a reddish tinge during particularly humid summer months. In his official statement, Reed explained his decision not to confront Morgan. "I believed I was witnessing a man engaged in some private activity that, while unusual, did not constitute a clear violation of law. Hollow Creek had experienced enough troubles without creating new ones by confronting a stranger about his nighttime wanderings. In retrospect, my caution was misplaced, and I bear the weight of what followed as heavily as anyone." It was on October 21, 1877, that the fragile equilibrium of Morgan's presence in Hollow Creek began to unravel. Martha Winters, while cleaning the adjacent room, overheard Morgan engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. What disturbed her, as she later recounted to Sheriff Grayson, was not the anger in Morgan's voice, but the fact that no second voice ever responded. He spoke in alternating tones, as if addressing someone and then answering himself in a different cadence. The words she could discern suggested an argument about payment and what was promised. Martha's sworn statement, taken on October 23rd, records, "I could hear him clearly through the wall, first speaking in his usual manner, then responding in a voice so changed I would not have recognized it as his. The first voice, his normal voice, kept saying, 'It was not the agreement,' and 'The time is not yet right.' Then the second voice, lower and somehow older, would respond with things like, 'The debt must be paid,' and 7 lives for 7 lives. At one point, the argument grew so heated that I feared violence might erupt, though how a man could do violence to himself in such a manner, I cannot say. Then came a silence so sudden and complete that I pressed my ear to the wall, fearing I know not what. After several minutes, I heard a sound like dry leaves being crushed underfoot, followed by a single sentence, spoken in a voice that was neither of the two I had heard before. 'Hollow Creek will settle the debt.' I confess I fled downstairs and did not return to the upper floor until I heard him leave the house some time later. That same evening, Isaac Turner's 18-year-old son, James, returned from a hunting trip with a strange account. While tracking deer in the forests northeast of town, he had discovered a freshly dug pit, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, with a mound of excavated soil beside it. Nearby, he had found an unusual arrangement of stones in a circular pattern, with what appeared to be animal bones placed at specific intervals around the perimeter. When he described the location to his father, Isaac realized it was in the vicinity of the old Stewart property. James Turner's description, as recorded in his own statement to Sheriff Grayson, provides disturbing details omitted from most official accounts. The pit was dug with care, the sides straight and even, like a proper grave. But it was what lay at the bottom that made me step back. There was a bed of pine boughs arranged neatly, and on top of them lay 7 objects that I first took to be twigs, but upon closer inspection recognized as human finger bones, yellowed with age. They were arranged in a pattern like a 7-pointed star. The stone circle around the pit contained 7 larger stones, and between each was placed what appeared to be a jawbone. Not human, I think, but from various animals. Deer, fox, what might have been a bear, and others I couldn't identify. At the head of the pit, where a headstone might stand, was a wooden marker with 7 notches carved into it. I'm not a superstitious man, but looking at that arrangement, I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The following morning, Deputy Reed, along with Isaac and James Turner, rode out to investigate the site. According to the official report filed later that week, they found the pit just as James had described, but the stone arrangement had been dismantled, with no trace of the bones that had been observed the previous day. More disturbing was what they discovered when they cautiously approached the Stewart house itself. The front door, which had been boarded shut for years, had been meticulously removed from its hinges and leaned against the adjacent wall. Inside, in what had once been the main living area, they found a table that had not been there during Reed's previous observation. On the table lay a map of Hollow Creek and the surrounding area, with several locations marked with red X's. One such mark was directly over the cemetery where the Confederate soldiers were buried. Another was placed over the boarding house. A third marked the Stewart house itself. Reed's report contains a detail often overlooked in later accounts. The map appeared to be an original military survey from 1863, the kind used by artillery officers to calculate firing positions. The paper was yellowed and creased along fold lines that had clearly been opened and closed many times over the years. The red markings were fresh, the ink still possessing a slight sheen in the light from the doorway. 7 locations were marked in total: the Confederate grave, the boarding house, the Stewart house, the church, the sheriff's office, Turner's Forge, and a 7th point in the forest where no known structure exists. When we searched the remaining rooms, we found evidence of recent occupation: ashes in the fireplace, a bedroll in what had once been the parlor, and food scraps suggesting someone had been living in the house for several days at least. Most disturbing was a discovery in what had been the master bedroom. On the wall, someone had driven 7 nails in a circular pattern, and hanging from each nail was a small cloth bag. When James Turner moved to examine one, I stopped him. Something about their arrangement suggested they should not be disturbed. When the men returned to town to report their findings to Sheriff Grayson, they learned that Elias Morgan had not been seen since the previous evening. His room at the boarding house remained locked. After deliberation, Grayson made the decision to force entry into Morgan's quarters. What they found inside has been described in multiple accounts, though with notable inconsistencies that suggest the witnesses themselves struggled to process what they had seen. The room had been transformed. The furniture had been pushed against the walls, creating an open space in the center. The floorboards in this space had been pried up, exposing the joists and the crawlspace below. Suspended from the ceiling beam was a lantern that cast distorted shadows across the room. The walls, previously covered with faded floral wallpaper, had been overlaid with dozens of pages torn from various books and documents. These pages, when later examined by Sheriff Grayson and Dr. Blackwood, appeared to be a mixture of biblical texts, astronomical charts, military field reports, and personal correspondence dating back to the early 1860s. Dr. Blackwood's personal journal provides the most clinical description of the scene. The room presented a tableau of methodical madness. The pages affixed to the walls followed no discernible pattern at first glance, but upon closer examination I detected a spiral arrangement, beginning at the door and circling clockwise around the room, terminating at the window. The content progressed from military documents, orders of battle, casualty reports, field commendations, to personal letters, primarily correspondence between soldiers and their families, then to religious texts, predominantly focusing on passages concerning resurrection, judgment, and eternal life, and finally to astronomical and mathematical calculations whose purpose I cannot determine. The effect was that of entering a mind turned inside out, its contents displayed with a terrible, ordered precision, but what commanded immediate attention was Morgan's leather satchel, placed precisely in the center of the exposed area. When Sheriff Grayson carefully opened it, he discovered several items that defied immediate explanation. A journal bound in what appeared to be human skin, a collection of teeth wrapped in a Confederate battle flag, and 7 bullets arranged in a straight line. The journal, which would later become a central piece of evidence, contained entries dating back to 1863, all written in the same precise handwriting, but signed with 7 different names. Sheriff Grayson's official report describes the journal in these terms. The book measures approximately 6 inches by 8 inches, with a cover of leather that exhibits unusual grain patterns inconsistent with cattle, pig, or other common sources. The binding appears hand-stitched, with what laboratory examination would later identify as human hair. The first entry is dated February 17, 1863, and begins with the words, "Today we died." It proceeds to describe in clinical detail the skirmish outside Hollow Creek and the deaths of 7 Confederate soldiers from the 21st Tennessee Infantry. The account is signed Elias Morgan, Samuel Cook, William Blackburn, Henry DeWitt, Thomas Rawlins, James Holt, and Edward Simmons. Subsequent entries alternate between these 7 signatories, though the handwriting remains consistent throughout, suggesting either a single author or an extraordinary effort to maintain uniformity across multiple writers. The final entry, dated October 21, 1877, read simply, "They are coming for what belongs to them. The debt will be settled in Hollow Creek." Beneath the floorboards, in the shallow crawl space, they found a canvas bag containing personal effects that appeared to date from the Civil War era, a pocket watch with the initials SC engraved on the case, a daguerreotype of a young woman in antebellum dress, a Confederate officer's insignia, and 7 identical Bowie knives, each with a notch carved into the handle. These items were carefully arranged around a central object that Dr. Blackwood, in his medical capacity, identified as a human skull that had suffered severe trauma consistent with an artillery impact. Sheriff Grayson immediately organized a search party. Given the disturbing nature of the discoveries, he deputized 6 additional men, including Isaac Turner and William Harmon. They split into 3 groups to cover more ground, with strict instructions to locate Morgan, but not to approach him alone. Grayson himself, accompanied by Deputy Reed, chose to investigate the Stewart property more thoroughly, believing it might serve as Morgan's alternative base of operations. The search party assigned to the northern sector, led by William Harmon, reported an unsettling discovery in the woods approximately 1 mile from town. They found what appeared to be a campsite recently abandoned, with embers still warm in a small fire pit. Around the fire, 7 stones had been placed in a circle, each bearing a crude carving that Harmon described as resembling a human face. Beside the fire lay a dead fox, its throat cut, and its blood apparently drained into a container that had been removed. Most disturbing was a message scratched into the trunk of a nearby oak. 747, followed by what appeared to be a tally of 4 marks. As dusk approached on October 22nd, the search had yielded no results. Morgan seemed to have vanished. The town fell into an uneasy silence as women and children were advised to remain indoors. Men stood watch on porches, shotguns across their laps, eyes straining against the gathering darkness. A persistent rain had begun to fall, adding to the sense of isolation and dread that had descended upon Hollow Creek. It was close to midnight when the first gunshot shattered the silence. It came from the direction of the general store, followed immediately by shouts and the sound of breaking glass. Sheriff Grayson and Deputy Reed, who had returned from the Stewart house empty-handed, rushed toward the commotion. According to multiple witness accounts, they arrived to find the front window of Harmon's store completely destroyed. Inside, illuminated by a single oil lamp that had somehow remained lit, stood Elias Morgan. But something about his appearance had changed dramatically. The neat, if somewhat severe figure who had moved among them for weeks was gone. In his place stood a man whose clothes were caked with mud, whose beard was matted with what appeared to be blood, and whose pale eyes now burned with an unnatural intensity. Most disturbing of all, according to Dr. Blackwood's subsequent examination report, Morgan's shirt was torn open to reveal what appeared to be old bullet wounds across his chest and abdomen, wounds that had long since healed into puckered scars. Elizabeth Harmon, who witnessed the scene from the family's living quarters above the store, provided this account. He stood amid the broken glass like a man risen from the grave. His clothes hung in tatters, revealing skin that seemed more scar tissue than flesh. But it was his face that haunts me still. The beard was gone on one side, showing what looked like an old wound where a bullet might have torn through his cheek. Yet the skin had healed in a way that suggested years had passed since the injury. His eyes reflected the lamplight like a predator's in the forest dark. When he smiled at Sheriff Grayson, I saw that several of his teeth were missing, and those that remained were stained with something dark that I pray was merely tobacco juice. What followed has been pieced together from the testimonies of multiple witnesses, though the sequence of events remains disputed. Sheriff Grayson called for Morgan to surrender himself. Morgan responded with a laugh described by Martha Winters, who was watching from the boarding house across the street as hollow and dry, like autumn leaves, crushed underfoot. He then began to recite what several witnesses identified as the names of the Confederate soldiers, buried in the mass grave at the edge of town. When Deputy Reed moved to enter the store, Morgan drew a revolver from his belt and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Reed in the shoulder, sending him staggering backward. Sheriff Grayson, Isaac Turner, and 2 other deputized men immediately returned fire. According to the official report, Morgan was struck at least 7 times at close range, twice in the chest, once in the neck, once in the face, and 3 times in the torso. Dr. Blackwood, who arrived moments after the shooting, would later testify, "I have treated gunshot wounds throughout my career, beginning on the battlefields of the late war, and I can state with medical certainty that no man should have remained standing after sustaining the injuries I observed. The neck wound alone should have severed the carotid artery, resulting in death within minutes from exsanguination. Yet not only did the subject remain conscious, but he exhibited none of the physiological responses typical of catastrophic injury, no signs of shock, no loss of motor control, no evidence of pain. Morgan fell backward against the store counter, but, in a moment that would haunt witnesses for decades to come, did not immediately die. Instead, as recorded in 5 separate accounts, he straightened himself, touched each of his wounds with deliberate precision, and smiled. "Not enough," he reportedly said. "Never enough." Isaac Turner's statement describes what happened next. As we watched, unable to move from either fear or disbelief, he began to change before our eyes. The fresh wounds we had just inflicted seemed to age rapidly, the bleeding stopping as the edges drew together. Within moments, they resembled the older scars visible elsewhere on his body. Then he looked directly at Sheriff Grayson and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. 7 lives taken, 7 lives returned. The circle must be completed. He raised his revolver again, but instead of aiming at any of us, he placed the barrel against his temple and pulled the trigger. The gun discharged with a sound unlike any normal firearm, deeper somehow, and resonating as if in a cavern rather than the confines of the store. What happened next defies rational explanation and formed the basis for decades of debate among those who studied the case. The oil lamp that had been illuminating the interior of the store suddenly extinguished itself, plunging the scene into darkness. Several witnesses reported hearing a sound like rushing wind, though the rain outside had ceased. When Sheriff Grayson managed to light a match, illuminating the store once more, Elias Morgan was gone. The initial assumption was that Morgan, despite his wounds, had somehow escaped through the back door of the store. A second search was immediately organized, with blood trails followed into the darkness. These trails, according to Sheriff Grayson's report, led in multiple directions, an impossibility that was initially attributed to the confusion and poor visibility. By dawn, no trace of Morgan had been found beyond the bloodstains that ended abruptly at various points around the town perimeter. Most perplexing was the discovery made by Deputy Reed when he examined the spot where Morgan had fallen. Among the shattered glass and pools of blood lay 7 spent bullets, the very rounds that had struck Morgan during the confrontation. According to Reed's statement, each bullet was flattened, as if it had struck something far harder than human flesh. More disturbing still, each bore a small carving on its base, visible only upon close inspection. The carvings appeared to be initials, E.M., S.C., W.B., H.D., T.R., J.H., and E.S., corresponding to the 7 names from Morgan's journal. Deputy Reed's wound, while painful, proved non-fatal. Dr. Blackwood's treatment notes indicate that the bullet had passed clean through the shoulder muscle without striking bone or major vessels. Reed would later claim that his recovery was unnaturally quick, with the wound healing completely within 2 weeks, a detail that would add to the growing mythology surrounding the events in Hollow Creek. In the days that followed, Sheriff Grayson conducted a thorough investigation of both Morgan's room and the Stewart property. The journal found in Morgan's satchel became the focus of intense scrutiny. The 7 names signed to various entries, Elias Morgan, Samuel Cook, William Blackburn, Henry DeWitt, Thomas Rollins, James Holt, and Edward Simmons, were cross-referenced with military records. A startling pattern emerged. All 7 men had served in the same Confederate unit, the 21st Tennessee Infantry. All 7 had been reported killed in the same skirmish outside Hollow Creek in 1863, and all 7, according to battlefield accounts preserved in the state archives in Nashville, had been buried in the mass grave at the edge of town. One particular entry in the journal, dated March 3, 1863, provides what might be the closest thing to an explanation found in the primary sources. "We died together in this place, yet we live. The bargain was sealed with blood and bound with fire. 7 lives for 7 lives. But the terms were not as promised. We are 1 and 7, 7 and 1. We walk between worlds, neither living nor dead, bound to each other and to the earth where our blood was spilled. The cycle must be completed before release can be granted. Every 25 years, the debt must be acknowledged and the payment offered. Until then, we remain as we are, fragments of men, sharing one form, one purpose, one unending existence." The implications of this discovery were too disturbing for many to accept. Sheriff Grayson's official report, submitted to the county authorities in Maryville on October 30, 1877, made no mention of the possible connection between Morgan and the buried soldiers. Instead, it presented a more palatable explanation. Morgan was likely a disturbed veteran with delusions about being connected to the deceased soldiers who had fled into the wilderness after being wounded and subsequently perished from his injuries. This explanation satisfied the authorities in Maryville, who were reluctant to pursue an investigation that might reflect poorly on the region's stability during the delicate Reconstruction period. The case was officially closed in November 1877, with Elias Morgan listed as deceased, though no body was ever recovered. The aftermath of the events in Hollow Creek unfolded gradually, like ripples spreading from a stone cast into still water. In the immediate wake of Morgan's disappearance, the town attempted to return to its normal rhythms. The broken window at Harmon's store was repaired. Deputy Reed recovered from his wound. The disturbing items found in Morgan's room were locked away in Sheriff Grayson's office, intended for eventual transfer to county authorities, but ultimately remaining in Hollow Creek. Yet beneath this veneer of resumed normalcy, profound changes were taking place. Residents reported difficulty sleeping, plagued by nightmares featuring pale eyes watching from darkness. Children refused to walk past the boarding house where Morgan had stayed. Several families, without announcing their intentions, quietly packed their belongings and departed for relatives in more populous areas, leaving their homes standing empty. Martha Winter's journal entries from November and December 1877 chronicle this gradual disintegration. November 15th found Mrs. Caldwell crying on her porch this morning. When I asked what troubled her, she claimed to have seen Mr. Morgan standing at the edge of her property in the pre-dawn light, watching her house. Sheriff Grayson investigated, but found no footprints in the soft earth where she claimed the figure had stood. November 28th. The Patterson family left before sunrise today, their wagon loaded with all their possessions. No goodbyes, no explanations. Their daughter Emma had been claiming for weeks that she heard whispering coming from beneath her bed each night, voices reciting names she didn't recognize. December 10th. The church stands nearly empty on Sundays now. Reverend Miller speaks to rows of vacant pews, his sermons increasingly focused on redemption and the forgiveness of sins. I find myself unable to enter the building, though I cannot articulate why. For the residents of Hollow Creek, however, the matter was far from resolved. The events of October 1877 cast a long shadow over the community. Martha Winters closed her boarding house the following spring and relocated to relatives in Nashville. William Harmon sold his store in 1878 and moved his family to Kentucky. Over the next decade, more than half of Hollow Creek's residents would leave, citing various reasons that carefully avoided direct reference to what had occurred. By 1890, the settlement had effectively ceased to exist, with the remaining structures gradually reclaimed by the surrounding forest. Sheriff Grayson was among the last to leave. His final report before departing for a position in Knoxville contains a passage rarely quoted in official accounts. I can no longer maintain the fiction that what occurred here has a rational explanation. While I have publicly supported the theory that Morgan was simply a disturbed individual who likely perished from his wounds in the wilderness, I do not believe this to be the truth. What we encountered that night was something beyond my capacity to explain within the framework of natural law. I leave this record not as an official document, but as a warning to any who might stumble upon this place in years to come. Some debts once incurred cannot be escaped. Some wounds never heal, and some dead refuse to remain buried. What makes this case particularly enduring in the annals of Tennessee's darker history is not just the inexplicable disappearance of a man who, by all accounts, should have died on the floor of Harmon's General Store. It is the series of incidents that occurred in the years that followed, suggesting that whatever came to Hollow Creek in the form of Elias Morgan never truly left. In 1879, a hunting party from Maryville discovered the remains of a man in the forests near where Hollow Creek had stood. According to the coroner's report, the body was in an advanced state of decomposition, making identification impossible. What drew attention, however, were the multiple gunshot wounds evident in the skeletal remains, wounds that matched the pattern reportedly inflicted upon Morgan. The matter might have ended there, with the assumption that Morgan's body had finally been discovered, had it not been for a second discovery made that same year. Approximately 20 miles away, near the town of Sevierville, the coroner who examined the remains near Sevierville, Dr. Jonathan Pierce, noted several peculiarities in his official report. The deceased appears to have suffered multiple gunshot wounds consistent with those that would prove instantly fatal. Yet the position of the body and other evidence at the scene suggest the individual survived these injuries long enough to travel some distance before expiring. More curious still is the state of the wounds themselves, which show signs of healing inconsistent with their apparent severity. Most perplexing is the discovery, clutched in what remains of the right hand, of a pocket watch bearing the initials H.D., corresponding to Henry DeWitt, a Confederate soldier reportedly killed near Hollow Creek in 1863. There, another body was found with an identical pattern of gunshot wounds, and in 1881, a third such discovery was made near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. In each case, decomposition prevented identification, and in each case, local authorities, unaware of the connection to Hollow Creek, treated the findings as isolated incidents, likely the results of robbery or personal disputes turned violent. The third body, discovered by a survey team mapping the border region, presented yet another unexplainable detail. According to the team's report to state authorities, the remains were located in a small clearing that appeared to have been deliberately created, with trees felled in a circular pattern around the body. The deceased had evidently suffered multiple gunshot wounds, yet had survived long enough to create what can only be described as a ritual arrangement at the site of his death. 7 stones were placed in a circle around where he finally collapsed, and carved into a nearby tree trunk were 7 names, one of which was partially obscured by moss but appeared to read Thomas R. It was not until 1885 that these separate cases were connected, thanks to the efforts of Josiah Blackwood, the son of Hollow Creek's physician, who had inherited his father's papers following the elder Blackwood's death in 1882. Josiah, who had pursued an education in criminal law, became obsessed with reconstructing the events surrounding Elias Morgan. His investigation, documented in a monograph titled The Hollow Creek Incident, a study in rural violence and mass delusion, presented the first comprehensive timeline of events and attempted to reconcile the various testimonies into a coherent narrative. Josiah's work was driven partly by personal connection. His father had been one of the primary witnesses to the events, and partly by a lawyer's determination to find rational explanations for seemingly irrational occurrences. His methodology was rigorous, involving extensive interviews with surviving witnesses, examination of official reports, and visits to each location where remains had been discovered. His personal correspondence reveals the toll this investigation took. I find myself unable to sleep through the night, my dreams haunted by images I have only read about, but which my mind insists on rendering in vivid detail. I am beginning to understand why so many who were present that night in Harmon's store have refused to discuss what they witnessed. Some horrors, once acknowledged, can never be unseen. Blackwood's work brought him into contact with authorities across eastern Tennessee, leading to the discovery of the pattern of bodies with matching gunshot wounds. His conclusion, though presented with academic caution, suggested something that locals had whispered for years, that Elias Morgan, or whatever entity had assumed that identity, had not been laid to rest by the bullets fired in Harmon's store. Instead, it had continued to move through the region, perhaps changing identities as it went. In a particularly revealing passage, Blackwood wrote, "If we accept, for the sake of argument, that the entity known as Elias Morgan somehow embodied aspects of 7 deceased Confederate soldiers, then the discovery of 3 bodies in the years following the Hollow Creek incident takes on a chilling significance. Each body bore evidence of the same wounds inflicted upon Morgan, yet each was found with items connecting it to a different one of the 7 names listed in Morgan's journal. It is as if, having been killed in Hollow Creek, the entity fragmented, with each fragment seeking a separate resting place. This raises the disturbing question, what of the remaining 4? The monograph, privately published in 1887, received little attention beyond academic circles. Blackwood himself eventually abandoned his investigation, accepting a position at a law firm in Memphis in 1888. His collection of documents, including the original journals and reports, was donated to the University of Tennessee Archives in 1891, where it remained largely untouched for decades. A colleague at the law firm later recalled, "Josiah never spoke of his research into the Hollow Creek matter, but its effects were evident in his behavior. He refused to travel east of Knoxville on firm business. He maintained 7 locks on his office door, an eccentricity we tolerated due to his otherwise brilliant legal mind. And each year, on October 22nd, he would fail to appear at work, instead spending the day in seclusion at his home, the curtains drawn, a loaded revolver on his desk. When I once inquired about this annual ritual, he replied only, 'Some anniversaries are best observed in preparation rather than celebration.' Interest in the case might have faded entirely were it not for a series of events that occurred in the winter of 1902, 25 years after Morgan's appearance in Hollow Creek. In December of that year, a man arrived in the town of Johnson City, approximately 80 miles northeast of where Hollow Creek had once stood. He took a room at the Wayfarers Inn and gave his name as William Blackburn. one of the 7 names that had appeared in Morgan's journal. According to local newspaper accounts, Blackburn claimed to be a historian researching the aftermath of the Civil War in eastern Tennessee. For 2 weeks, he conducted interviews with elderly residents, focusing particularly on those who had served in or had knowledge of the 21st Tennessee Infantry. His questions, as reported by those who spoke with him, centered on burial practices during the war and the location of mass graves. The proprietor of the Wayfarers Inn, Thomas Jenkins, provided this description of his guest. Mr. Blackburn was a striking figure, tall and lean, with a bearing that suggested military training despite his advanced age. His face bore a dramatic scar that ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth, which he claimed was a souvenir from Shiloh. Most remarkable were his eyes, pale to the point of colorlessness, yet intense in their focus. He paid for 2 weeks' lodging in advance, using coins that I later realized were Confederate currency. When I pointed this out, he smiled in a way that made me deeply uneasy and said, "Some currencies retain their value long after governments fall." On December 21, 1902, exactly 25 years to the day after the shootout in Harmon's store, Blackburn checked out of the Wayfarers Inn and was never seen again. His room, when examined by the proprietor, was found to contain dozens of maps with various locations marked, mirroring the discovery made in Morgan's room a quarter-century earlier. Most disturbing of all was a journal, bound in what appeared to be leather, containing entries signed by 7 different names, the same 7 associated with Morgan's journal. The Johnson City authorities, unfamiliar with the Hollow Creek incident, treated Blackburn's disappearance as unremarkable. A drifter had come and gone, leaving behind some peculiar belongings. The matter would likely have been forgotten had it not been for a young journalist named Edward Prentice, who had been assigned to write a piece on local Christmas traditions and happened to interview several of the people who had spoken with Blackburn. One such interviewee, a retired school teacher named Margaret Hanson, recounted her conversation with Blackburn. He asked such strange questions, not just about the war, which many historians study, but specifically about how the dead were treated when there wasn't time for proper burial. He wanted to know if soldiers ever performed rituals over their fallen comrades, if there were words spoken or objects placed with the bodies. When I mentioned that my father, who served with the 21st Tennessee, had once told me of a pact some soldiers made to return for each other if they fell in battle, Mr. Blackburn became intensely focused. "Did he mention 7 men?" he asked. "Did he speak of a binding oath?" When I said I couldn't recall such details, his disappointment was palpable. Before leaving, he said something I found peculiar. "The circle remains unbroken, but time grows short." Intrigued by their accounts, Prentice began to investigate Blackburn's activities. His inquiries eventually led him to the University of Tennessee Archives and Josiah Blackwood's monograph. The connection between Blackburn and the Hollow Creek incident became the subject of a series of articles published in the Johnson City Chronicle in early 1903, under the title "The Man Who Wouldn't Die, A Tale of Tennessee's Most Haunting Mystery." Prentice's articles, written with the dramatic flair typical of early 20th century journalism, captivated readers across eastern Tennessee. His opening paragraph set the tone. "In the dying days of 1902, a ghost walked among us. Not a spectral apparition glimpsed by moonlight, but a flesh and blood revenant whose presence in Johnson City marked another revolution in a cycle of horror that began in the blood-soaked fields of our late conflict and continues, with mechanical precision, to unfold at 25-year intervals. This is the tale of Elias Morgan, who died in 1877, yet lived to walk again as William Blackburn in 1902, and who may well return under yet another name. In 1927, Prentice's articles revived public interest in the case and prompted a more thorough examination of the pattern Josiah Blackwood had identified years earlier. Records from across eastern Tennessee were reviewed, revealing a disturbing consistency. Every 25 years, dating back to 1852, reports emerged of a stranger arriving in small communities, asking questions about Civil War casualties, followed by unexplained disappearances or deaths. The pattern had repeated in 1852, 1877, and now 1902. The 1852 incident, previously unconnected to the later events, involved a man identifying himself as Captain James Holt, who had appeared in the settlement that would later become Hollow Creek, claiming to be surveying the area for potential military significance. Witnesses described him as tall and gaunt, with unusually pale eyes. According to church records preserved by the Methodist congregation, Holt spent several days examining the local terrain before departing suddenly after a confrontation with local residents. The nature of this confrontation was not recorded, but the church registry notes that prayers were offered the following Sunday for those affected by the violence at the Stewart farm. This 25-year cycle became the focus of considerable speculation. Some suggested it represented some form of generational revenge, with descendants of the original Confederate soldiers carrying on a tradition of retribution. Others, of a more superstitious bent, spoke of curses and unnatural lifespans. Edward Prentice, in the final article of his series, proposed a more measured theory that the events represented a form of memorial or ritual, perpetuated perhaps by a secret society of Confederate sympathizers who had never accepted the outcome of the war. The true horror of this case, Prentice wrote, may lie not in supernatural possibilities, but in the lengths to which human devotion, or obsession, will go to honor perceived obligations to the dead. If, as some evidence suggests, a pact was made among 7 soldiers of the 21st Tennessee to return for each other, then what we may be witnessing is the terrible fulfillment of that oath, carried forward through generations in a macabre tradition of remembrance. Whatever the explanation, the pattern suggested that the next occurrence would take place in 1927. As that year approached, interest in the case resurged. Journalists and curiosity seekers began to monitor small communities throughout eastern Tennessee, waiting for signs of a stranger asking questions about Civil War graves. Law enforcement agencies, though publicly skeptical, quietly instructed officers to report any individuals fitting the profile established from previous incidents. The December 1926 issue of the Knoxville Sentinel contained a feature titled, "The Christmas Visitor: Will Tennessee's Most Enduring Mystery Repeat This Year?" The article recounted the previous incidents and speculated on possible locations for the next appearance, given the pattern of eastward movement from Hollow Creek to Johnson City. Several small towns in the region reported an influx of tourists and journalists as December 1927 approached, each hoping to witness or prevent the next chapter in the cycle. December 1927 came and went without incident. No reports emerged of mysterious visitors or unusual disappearances. The anticipated continuation of the cycle failed to materialize, leading many to conclude that the pattern had been coincidental, or that Prentice's theory of a multi-generational ritual had ended with the death of the last participant. The Knoxville Sentinel published a follow-up article in January 1928 titled "The Visitor Who Never Came," suggesting that public attention had effectively deterred whoever might have been planning to continue the cycle. The article concluded, "Perhaps the greatest power of legends is their ability to generate their own perpetuation through expectation. In bringing the Hollow Creek mystery into the light of public scrutiny, we may have broken a pattern that relied on obscurity and isolation to maintain its grip on our collective imagination." The case might have been relegated to the status of local legend had it not been for a discovery made in 1952 during the construction of a new highway that cut through the area where Hollow Creek had once stood. Workers excavating a section of hillside uncovered a small cave that had been sealed with stones. Inside, they found the remains of 7 men arranged in a circular pattern. Each skeleton bore evidence of multiple gunshot wounds. The foreman of the construction crew, Harold Jennings, described the scene in a statement to local authorities. "The cave wasn't natural. It had been dug into the hillside and carefully concealed. The entrance had been sealed with stones fitted together so precisely that we initially mistook it for a solid rock face. Inside, the space was about 15 feet in diameter, with a ceiling just high enough for a man to stand. The skeletons were arranged like spokes on a wheel, feet toward the center, heads toward the walls. Each skull had a bullet hole in it, and the rib cages showed evidence of multiple gunshot wounds. But what struck me most was that someone had placed personal effects with each body: a pocket watch, a belt buckle, a tobacco pipe, and so on. It was like a museum display of death. The discovery prompted an investigation by state authorities. The remains were estimated to be several decades old, though precise dating proved difficult. What caught the investigators' attention, however, was a journal found among the remains, preserved in a metal box. The journal, according to the official report, contained entries spanning from 1863 to 1927, signed with the 7 names that had been associated with Elias Morgan and William Blackburn. The forensic examiner assigned to the case, Dr. Robert Merrill, noted, "The journal presents a significant anomaly. While the paper and binding appear consistent with late 19th century materials, chemical analysis of the ink used in entries dated after 1900 indicates it was manufactured no earlier than 1920. This suggests either deliberate falsification of a historical document or, more disturbing, that entries were actually added over the span of decades, with the journal returning to this cave periodically." The final entry, dated December 21, 1927, read, "The circle is complete. We return to where it began. The debt is paid." This entry, written in a shaky hand, unlike the precise script of earlier pages, continued, "7 lives were taken at Hollow Creek in 1863, not by enemy fire as recorded, but by the treachery of our own commander, who sacrificed us to cover his retreat. We did not die immediately. In our final moments, as blood soaked into strange soil, we made a pact, sealed with dying breaths and the last of our strength. We would not rest until justice was done. We would return again and again until 7 lives had answered for our own. The first was claimed in 1877, the second in 1902. Tonight, the remaining 5 will join us. After 64 years, our wait ends. May God have mercy on our souls, for we have shown none to others." The remains were eventually reinterred in a marked grave at the Tennessee State Veterans Cemetery in 1954, following a determination that they likely belonged to Confederate veterans. The journal was transferred to the State Archives in Nashville, where it remained available to researchers until its mysterious disappearance during a cataloging project in 1968. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, the archivist responsible for the collection at the time, recounted, "The journal was stored in a climate-controlled vault, accessible only to staff and authorized researchers. On the morning of December 21, 1968, I arrived to find the vault door standing open, though security protocols had been followed the previous evening. The only item missing was the Hollow Creek Journal. In its place was a handwritten note that read simply, 'Some records are not meant to be kept.' The case was investigated by local police, but no suspects were ever identified, and the journal has never resurfaced. In 1963, a historian named Margaret Holcomb published a comprehensive study titled Echoes of Conflict, Persistent Myths and Legends of the Civil War in East Tennessee. One chapter was dedicated to the Hollow Creek incident and its aftermath. Holcomb presented a theory that attempted to reconcile the various elements of the case. According to her research, the 7 men named in the journal had indeed served together in the 21st Tennessee Infantry. However, contrary to official records, they had not all perished in the skirmish outside Hollow Creek. Instead, Holcomb suggested they had deserted their unit after participating in an atrocity, the massacre of Union sympathizers at a farmhouse near what would later become Hollow Creek. Holcomb had discovered court-martial proceedings long buried in military archives that detailed accusations against 7 members of the 21st Tennessee. The defendants, having been assigned to reconnoiter enemy positions, instead diverted to the Stewart farmstead, where they encountered civilians suspected of harboring Union loyalties. What followed, according to testimony from a local witness who escaped the scene, was a methodical execution of all present, men, women, and elderly alike. When Confederate forces later encountered Union troops in the vicinity, the defendants deliberately led their comrades into an ambush, resulting in 16 Confederate casualties. The defendants themselves were reported killed in the engagement, though their bodies were never positively identified among the fallen. The deserters, fearing retribution from both sides, had hidden in the surrounding wilderness. When Confederate forces searched for them, the deserters ambushed and killed their pursuers, then stripped them of their uniforms and personal effects. These bodies, rather than those of the deserters themselves, were buried in the mass grave at Hollow Creek. The 7 deserters, now presumed dead, were free to assume new identities. They scattered across the region, but, bound by their shared guilt and the blood they had shed together, maintained contact through a system of coded messages and predetermined meeting points. Their pact, as reconstructed by Holcomb from fragments of the journal and other sources, involved a vow to reconvene every 25 years at the site of their crimes, a vow sealed with blood and reinforced by a quasi-religious ritual they had developed, incorporating elements of folk magic and corrupted Christian symbolism. Elias Morgan, in this interpretation, was not a single individual but a composite identity, assumed in rotation by the surviving deserters. The name itself was significant, an anagram formed from the first letters of their original surnames. The purpose of each 25-year return was twofold: to ensure that their secret remained buried and to reenact their original crime as a form of perverse penance. The ritualistic elements we observe throughout this case, Holcomb wrote, suggest not supernatural forces, but the psychological burden of guilt transformed into obsessive behavior. The arrangement of stones, the circular patterns, the repeated number 7, these represent an attempt to contain and control overwhelming remorse through symbolic action. What witnesses interpreted as a man who could not die was likely a succession of individuals united by shared history and shared culpability, each adopting the mannerisms and carrying the physical scars of their predecessors. Holcomb's theory, while compelling in its attempt to provide a rational explanation, failed to address several key elements of the case. It could not account for the seemingly supernatural aspects of Morgan's disappearance from Harmon's store after sustaining multiple fatal wounds. Nor could it explain how the pattern of reappearances continued for 75 years, well beyond the likely lifespan of the original deserters. Nevertheless, Holcomb's work represented the most thorough attempt to demystify the Hollow Creek incident. Her research brought to light previously overlooked documents, including military court inquiries into the reported massacre that had been suppressed during the chaotic final years of the war. These records confirmed that a group of civilians had indeed been killed near the future site of Hollow Creek in 1862, though they attributed the killings to irregular Union forces rather than Confederate deserters. The final chapter in this strange saga came in 1977, 100 years after Morgan's appearance in Hollow Creek. A historian named David Sevier, researching a book on Reconstruction-era Tennessee, traveled to the area where Hollow Creek had once stood, now largely reclaimed by forest, with only a few stone foundations marking where buildings had once been. Sevier planned to spend several days camping at the site, hoping to gain insight into the geography that had played such a crucial role in the historical accounts. Sevier's research notes, recovered after his disappearance, reveal his growing fascination with the case. There is something about standing on the actual ground where these events unfolded that changes one's perspective entirely. Maps and written accounts cannot capture the isolation of this place. The way sound carries across the valley, the manner in which fog can suddenly envelop the landscape, transforming familiar terrain into something alien and threatening. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to glimpse a tall figure with pale eyes, watching from the tree line. On the night of December 21, 1977, exactly 100 years after the shootout in Harmon's store, Sevier's camp was discovered abandoned by a group of hikers. His tent remained standing, with his research materials neatly organized inside. A journal lay open on his sleeping bag, the final entry describing strange sounds coming from the direction of where the Stewart house had once stood. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of animal predation, and no trace of Sevier himself. The leader of the hiking group, Michelle Tanner, described the scene. Everything was in perfect order, as if Dr. Sevier had simply stepped away momentarily and was expected to return. His coffee cup still held liquid that was only slightly cool to the touch. His flashlight lay on top of an open book still switched on. The strangest detail was a circle of small stones that had been placed around the entire campsite, something that hadn't been there the previous day when we had passed the same location. Each stone had what looked like a tally mark scratched into its surface. A search of the surrounding area yielded a single clue. At the approximate location of the Confederate mass grave, searchers found a freshly dug pit, 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, with a mound of soil beside it. Around the pit, 7 stones had been arranged in a circle. The search coordinator, Ranger James Hollis, reported, "The pit appeared to have been dug recently, the soil still damp from excavation. Yet, when our team explored the hole, we found no evidence of recent human activity at the bottom. Instead, the earth appeared undisturbed for what forensic experts estimated to be at least 50 years. It was as if someone had removed a section of ground and then replaced it exactly as it had been decades earlier." Given the connection to the historical case, we expanded the search to include the cave discovered in 1952, but found it had been completely sealed by the highway construction. Ground-penetrating radar revealed no cavities in the vicinity. David Sevier was never found. His disappearance remains officially unsolved, listed in Tennessee Bureau of Investigation records as a probable case of misadventure in a remote area. His research materials, including extensive notes on the Hollow Creek incident, were eventually returned to his university department, where they formed the basis for a posthumous publication titled Shadows of the Reconstructed South, released in 1980. He the Bombs. Publication included a photographic appendixium containing images Sevier had taken during his research. Trips across eastern Tennessee. One photograph taken at the Hollow Creek site shortly before his disappearance shows the overgrown foundation of what was once Harmon's General Store. In the background, partially obscured by vegetation, stands a tall figure. Despite the distance and poor quality of the image, one detail is clearly visible: the figure's pale, almost colorless eyes, staring directly at the camera. Photography expert Carolyn Reeves, who analyzed the image at the request of Sevier's colleagues, noted an unexplainable anomaly. The figure appears to be standing approximately 30 feet behind the stone foundation, placing it among a dense growth of pine trees. However, when the negative is examined under magnification, there is no disruption of the foliage where the figure stands. It's as if the person is simultaneously present in the image and absent from the physical space it occupies. Furthermore, comparison with other photographs from the same roll of film shows this exact stand of trees without any human figure present, suggesting either remarkable stealth on the part of the subject or, more troublingly, manipulation of the image through means I cannot identify. The Hollow Creek incident and its aftermath represent one of the most persistent mysteries in Tennessee's post-Civil War history. From Elias Morgan's arrival in 1877 to David Sevier's disappearance in 1977, the case has defied conventional explanation. What began as an apparent case of deception and violence evolved into a century-spanning enigma that touched on themes of guilt, retribution, and the long shadows cast by conflict. The most recent academic examination of the case, published in a 1992 issue of the Journal of Southern Folklore and History, suggested that the entire narrative may represent a form of regional mythology, a story that evolved over time, incorporating elements of actual historical events but embellished through repeated tellings to address collective trauma and unresolved cultural tensions. Professor Alan Mercer, the author of this analysis, wrote, "What makes the Hollow Creek case so compelling is not just its longevity, but its adaptability. Each generation has found in it a reflection of its own anxieties, post-war reconciliation in the 1870s, economic uncertainty in the early 1900s, Cold War paranoia in the 1950s, and environmental concerns in the 1970s as development threatened to erase historical landscapes. The Outlaw Who Wouldn't Die becomes a vehicle for expressing deeper cultural fears about what refuses to remain buried, whether that be war crimes, social injustice, or environmental destruction. Yet for those who have stood in the quiet forests where Hollow Creek once existed, where the foundations of buildings slowly crumble beneath encroaching vegetation, where the unmarked grave of Confederate soldiers lies forgotten except by the most dedicated historians, there remains a palpable sense of unease. It is not just the natural silence of an abandoned place, but something deeper, a silence that seems to listen back. Park Ranger Teresa Collins, who has guided historical tours in the region since the 1990s, describes the phenomenon. "I've taken hundreds of groups through these woods, and there's a spot, roughly where Harmon's store would have stood, where conversation invariably dies. People don't comment on it until we've moved well away, but then many will mention feeling watched or experiencing a sudden drop in temperature. More than once, visitors have reported seeing a tall man in the distance, only to have him vanish when approached. What's particularly striking is that these sightings often come from people with no knowledge of the historical case. The records remain in archives in Nashville, Maryville, and Knoxville, in academic publications and newspaper accounts, in the memories passed down through generations of families who once called Eastern Tennessee home. They tell of a man who came to Hollow Creek in the autumn of 1877, who died but wouldn't stay dead, and whose legacy continues to echo through the hollow places of history. Perhaps, as some have suggested, the true horror of the Hollow Creek incident lies not in the possibility of supernatural occurrence, but in the very human capacity for violence, deception, and the creation of myths to obscure uncomfortable truths. The Outlaw Who Wouldn't Die may, in the final analysis, be less a ghost than a reflection, a persistent reminder of how the past refuses to remain buried, how old wounds continue to fester beneath the surface of progress, and how some debts once incurred can never truly be repaid. In the forests of eastern Tennessee, where Hollow Creek once stood, few venture after dark. Those who know the stories claim that on certain nights, particularly around the winter solstice, the sound of footsteps can be heard moving through the underbrush, steady, purposeful steps that circle the perimeter of the old settlement before stopping at what was once the entrance to Harmon's general store. Then, in the profound silence that follows, a single gunshot echoes through the trees. 7 times it repeats, and 7 times the forest absorbs the sound, until nothing remains but the weight of history and the whisper of questions that may never find answers. A final, disturbing coda to this century-spanning mystery emerged in December 2002, 125 years after Morgan's appearance and 25 years after Sevier's disappearance. A graduate student researching Tennessee folklore visited the Hollow Creek site and reported finding a freshly excavated pit matching the dimensions described in previous accounts. Around the pit lay 7 stones arranged in a circle. At the center of the circle was a journal bound in leather, containing a single entry dated December 21, 2002. The debt transfers. 7 becomes 1. 1 becomes 7. We return in 2027. The journal was submitted to the University of Tennessee's historical collection, but vanished before it could be properly cataloged. The graduate student who found it left his study shortly thereafter and was reported to have relocated to the western United States. His final communication with his academic advisor contained a cryptic warning. Some mysteries should remain unexplored. Some patterns should not be completed. I will not return to Tennessee in 2027, and I urge you to stay away as well. The land where Hollow Creek once stood is now largely inaccessible, incorporated into a state wildlife management area with restricted access. Park rangers report that despite these restrictions, they occasionally find evidence of visitors near the winter solstice, footprints leading to nowhere, circles of stones arranged around shallow depressions in the earth, and once, in December 2019, 7 spent bullet casings placed in a straight line atop what was once the foundation of Harmon's General Store. As 2027 approaches, interest in the case has begun to resurge among both academic researchers and paranormal enthusiasts. Will the pattern established over more than a century continue? Will another stranger with pale eyes appear in an eastern Tennessee community, carrying a leather satchel and asking questions about long-forgotten Confederate graves? Or has the cycle finally been broken, the debt, whatever it might have been, at last repaid? For now, the forest keeps its secrets. The wind whispers through pine needles, carrying echoes of gunshots fired in 1877. And somewhere, perhaps, 7 souls wait for their appointed hour to return once more to the place where they died, where they lived, and where the mystery of the outlaw who wouldn't die continues to haunt the hollow places of Tennessee's history.